Some names don't echo, they linger. Harrison Ford hadn't stepped inside Rustwood Grill in over 3 years, but on a quiet night in October, he ordered a simple steak and found something hidden beneath the plate. 4 words, written by hand, and that was enough. Enough to uncover a lie buried beneath silence and fear in a place he once helped build. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. He walked in just after 4 p.m., a man in a weathered leather jacket and a faded cap pulled low. The wind outside barely whispered, but inside the quiet had teeth. No one looked up. Not the hostess flipping through laminated menus, not the manager muttering into a headset, and not the young man picking up broken glass near the salad bar. The restaurant was tired in a way that lights couldn't fix. It smelled like freezer grease, pretending to be butter and ambition that had long since evaporated into heat lamp air. Harrison Ford didn't say a word. He pointed to the far booth by the window and waited. The hostess blinked, hesitated, then nodded. He sat without taking off his coat. His eyes stayed hidden beneath the brim, but his posture said everything. He wasn't there to be seen. The chair creaked under him. The cushions sagged. The menu he unfolded was curled at the edges and smeared with fingerprints someone stopped bothering to clean weeks ago. He scanned it out of habit, not interest. The lights above table 6 flickered once, then again. A camera near the hallway blinked red, then black. Harrison noticed. No one else did. The dining room, half full, moved like a place stuck in second gear. The couple to his right chewed without speaking. A teenager in a busser apron wiped the same table twice without seeing it. The overhead speaker let out a faint crackle, like it forgot how to play music. Years ago, this place had felt different. Back when he and 2 old friends from the indie circuit had scraped together just enough to build something that could outlast them. No fanfare, no name on the deed, just quiet faith in honest work. But time had a way of rotting through the corners first. Now it was paper menus and duct tape on the register and a staff that moved like they were waiting for impact. He looked up as a waitress approached. She was young, maybe 23, with eyes that never stayed still. Her name tag read Elena, though the left corner was chipped. She held a water glass like it weighed more than it should and placed it down without a word. Her smile was the kind people wore when they'd practiced too long in the mirror. Before he could speak, not that he intended to, she whispered something, too soft for the room, but sharp enough for him to hear. "Thank you for last night." He didn't answer, didn't blink. She was already walking away. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, something else shifted. He leaned back slightly in the booth, scanning the room without moving his head. The manager, a man in his 40s with slick hair and cologne that clung like desperation, barked at a busser for stacking trays unevenly. No one argued, no one corrected. The headset crackled in his ear again as he paced near the kitchen pass. A glass fell somewhere in the back, followed by silence. No reaction. Harrison reached for the menu again, not to read it, but to remember. To remember what this place was supposed to be. A steakhouse with dignity, a refuge from noise, built with hands that remembered how to hold a hammer, not just a spreadsheet. And now here he was, sitting at its edge like a man visiting a grave he helped dig. He took a sip of water, metallic. Elena passed the kitchen door, glancing toward the back office before returning to the server station. Her movements were tight, precise, not from training, survival. She wiped a clean counter twice, eyes fixed on the floor. Harrison had seen it before, on sets where PAs were yelled at for things they couldn't control. In workshops where apprentices flinched from foremen instead of learning from them. His steak hadn't been ordered yet, but the tension had already been served. From the far booth, a busboy lost grip on a tray. It crashed hard, forks, plates, water glasses all over the tile. The sound froze the room. No one helped. Not one soul moved. The manager didn't even look up. Elena stood in place, watching, waiting. Harrison leaned forward just slightly, just enough to note who flinched and who didn't. She returned 5 minutes later, still carrying only the water pitcher. She refilled his glass slowly, hands trembling slightly. She wasn't looking at him. Not until the very last second, when she set the pitcher down and whispered again, eyes darting to the kitchen. "Thank you for letting him in." He didn't move, didn't nod, didn't confirm or deny, but inside the air turned colder. He hadn't let anyone in last night. He hadn't been here, not until now. The restaurant moved like a machine that had forgotten its own purpose. Every motion felt rehearsed, but not in the way precision is born. It was the kind of routine that comes from exhaustion, from too many nights ending the same way. Harrison Ford sat still in the booth by the window, the glass of water untouched, his hands resting on the table like anchors. His eyes didn't roam, but they saw everything. The light above table 6 flickered again, once, twice, then settled into a dull buzz. The camera near the hallway blinked red for a moment, then stopped altogether. The register near the host stand jammed when someone tried to print a receipt. The manager didn't notice. He was too busy talking into the wire that dangled from his collar like a leash. Lance Morgan wore his authority like a costume, pressed shirt, tucked two neatly polished shoes that never stepped near grease. He didn't walk so much as glide, weaving through the floor with a tablet in one hand and judgment in the other. His voice cut through the static of the room like radio feedback. "You call that clean?" He snapped at a busboy near the coffee station. "I can still see your fingerprints on the silverware. You want me to do your job for you?" The boy looked down, said nothing, just wiped again. Harrison didn't move, but inside something pulled taut. The voice wasn't loud, but it was constant. Lance barked into his headset again. "Table 11 is still waiting. What, you all asleep back there? Move." No one looked him in the eye. Staff turned sideways to pass him, like he was a moving wire you didn't want to brush against. Elena reappeared, tray balanced in both hands. She walked slower this time. Her shoulders sat higher than before, like she was trying to keep the weight in more than just the tray. She approached without a word and placed the plate in front of him. The steak, medium rare, grilled onions, no potatoes. Her hands lingered half a second too long. Harrison's eyes met hers, only for a second. But it was enough to catch the strain in her face. The muscles pulled tight. The breath held mid-exhale. Then she turned and walked away. He waited. The plate was warm, not hot. The kind of temperature that came from sitting under a lamp just a bit too long. But there was something else, something uneven beneath it. He shifted the plate slightly. Nothing, then more, just enough to hear the faintest crinkle. He lifted the edge slowly, a square of plastic tucked beneath the charger, zip-sealed, lightly fogged from heat. Inside, a folded napkin, not restaurant stock, thicker, torn on one side. Handwritten ink smudged slightly, but still legible. 4 words, "He has your name too." Harrison didn't move, didn't react, but inside the room changed. Until now he had been an observer, someone checking for rot in the corners. But this wasn't suspicion. This was confirmation. Someone was using his name. He turned the napkin over. More words. "We thought it was you. He said you said it was fine. We let him in because he looked like he belonged." No signature, no date, but the message was clear. Elena hadn't been thanking him earlier. She had been thanking a ghost in his image, which meant whoever walked through the back door last night didn't just use his face. They used his name. Harrison leaned back in the booth, eyes on the floor, but mind now pacing. His name was never on the signage, never in the press. He had stayed silent by choice, a silent partner in every sense. So whoever dropped his name knew something they shouldn't, or pretended to know something they didn't. Either way, the damage was done. He slid the napkin back into the pouch, folded it once, then tucked it into the inside lining of his jacket. Elena was at the service station again, wiping menus that didn't need wiping, but her eyes kept glancing toward his table, not to see if he liked the food, not to check the steak. She was waiting to know if he had read it. He gave no sign, just lifted the fork, cut the edge of the meat, chewed slowly. Outside, a car passed. Its headlights lit the windows for half a second before fading. Inside, something else had lit up, something much harder to extinguish. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as the old Bronco pulled off the county road. No lights marked the turnoff. No signs, no mailbox, just a break in the brush and a rusted gate barely hanging on one hinge. Harrison Ford eased through like he'd done it 100 times before, because he had. The path curved behind a ridge, shielded by trees thick enough to swallow noise. At the end of it stood a warehouse that didn't belong to any map. No logos. No numbers. Just corrugated steel faded to ash gray, a padlock on the side door, and tire tracks that looked weeks old even when they were. He killed the engine. The wind settled instantly. Silence draped the place like dust. He stepped out, reached into the glove box, and pulled the key, small, tarnished, still warm from habit. Inside, the air carried the scent of old wiring and colder memories. The lights flickered to life in sections. One row at a time, they woke, casting long shadows across steel shelves and server racks. This place wasn't built to impress. It was built to survive. Years ago, Harrison had turned it from a film storage facility into something more private, more secure. A digital fallback no one asked about because no one knew to. He crossed the floor slowly, boots echoing soft on concrete. In one corner, a single monitor blinked to life on a long desk. Above it, a small sign still hung, laminated and crooked. Emergency backup only. He slid into the chair, cracked his knuckles, and woke the system. It responded like a dog that hadn't heard its name in years. One prompt, one password. Then it began. Footage rolled in silence. No music, no interface tricks. Just raw time-stamped video from the internal security network, feeds no one else knew existed. A failsafe he had hardwired into the frame during construction. He didn't trust cloud storage. Still didn't. He scrolled to the night before. Kitchen hallway, Lance standing by the walk-in cooler, hands stuffed in his pockets. Another man appeared, shorter, stockier, branded jacket from a known alcohol supplier. The man said nothing. Lance reached into a folder, thick envelope sealed. He handed it over like it was just paper. In return, the man slid a crate across the tile, no invoice, no scan, just friction and silence. Harrison paused. Backed it up 5 seconds, let it play again. From a different angle, the camera caught Lance smirking to himself. Timestamp, 10:42 p.m. He bookmarked it. Next feed, back hallway, Elena carrying a to-go cup of water. Her uniform wrinkled, eyes sunken. She walked toward the service exit, opened the door just enough to hand the cup to someone waiting. Older man, unshaven, coat too big for his frame. Before she could shut it, Lance stepped into frame. Fast, his mouth moved, loud even in silence. Then his hand came up. 2 fingers jabbed into Elena's shoulder. She stumbled back, caught herself against the wall, eyes wide, no retaliation. No response, just breath held and head low. Pause, frame frozen on her face. Not fear, not surprise, resignation. He had seen that look before. In grips on film sets, in production assistants cornered behind trailers, in actresses trying not to cry in the dark between takes. He marked the clip, opened a new tab. Audio archives. Most were ambient, kitchen noise, register buzz, overhead fan. One caught his attention, labeled manually. Friday 21:17, click, silence, then a voice. You give that out again and you're gone, Lance. The girl's voice was barely audible. Yes, sir, you think I'm bluffing? Click, end. Harrison exhaled through his nose, a habit, not frustration, focus. He opened the system dashboard, looked at the maintenance timer, scheduled autowipe in 29 minutes. The files, the footage, the audio, the logs, they were set to purge as part of a routine he had designed himself years ago. Back when the warehouse was just a backup plan, back when he thought he wouldn't need to look twice, he clicked into the drawer beneath the desk, pulled out a portable drive, thick casing, fireproof, plugged it in. The system recognized it. Backup initializing, a progress bar appeared, 3%, 4%, too slow. He opened log access in a second window, began exporting transactions, tip redistribution, clock out anomalies, patterns. Lance's name kept surfacing. Manual adjustments, overwrites, time stamps that didn't match staff hours, another name, deleted user. He flagged it all, saved screenshots, queued a secondary backup. Progress bar hit 18%, 28 minutes to go. The hum of the drives blended with the wind outside. In the quiet, Harrison didn't rush, didn't panic. He worked like someone who'd rebuilt engines without schematics, like someone who knew that justice didn't come from being loud. It came from being exact. He wasn't just watching a man steal, He was watching how the rot had spread. And now he had 27 minutes to save what mattered. The napkin in his pocket crinkled slightly as he shifted. Two kinds of evidence, one written in desperation, the other in pixels and silence. He wasn't going to let either disappear. The clouds sat low that afternoon, thick and unmoving, like they were waiting for something to break. Rustwood Grill was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from something being held back. The lunch crowd had cleared. The dinner rush hadn't started. That hour in between where time doesn't make much noise. Harrison Ford pulled into the gravel lot without fanfare. No music, no phone call, no hesitation. The Bronco engine cut off with a low rumble. He stepped out wearing a black buttoned-down shirt tucked clean, collar straight, no hat, no jacket. He walked through the front door without slowing down. The hostess at the podium froze mid-greeting. Her eyes locked on his face, like someone seeing a name they'd only ever heard whispered. One of the servers nearby took a step back. Harrison kept walking. Lance Morgan was standing near the expo counter, waving a tablet in one hand like a conductor who'd lost the beat. A glass of water had spilled across table 4, and he was in full performance mode. "This is why no one gets bonuses," he snapped. Wasted time, wasted product. He didn't notice Harrison at first, not until the sound in the room changed, not until the kitchen quieted faster than usual, not until the eyes started turning. When he turned, his smirk was already loaded. Well, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "2 nights in a row, you must really love the food." He chuckled, like that would carry him through. Harrison didn't answer. Lance gestured again, broader now, the salesman in him scrambling to regain footing. "I figured it out," he continued. "You're one of the investors, right? Silent partner or something. Look, I appreciate the drop-in. Things are under control." Harrison didn't blink. Lance tried again. "Sure, we've had bumps, a few minor issues. Staff turnover, that's normal, but we're on the upswing. New vendors, streamlined systems, lean and mean." Harrison reached into his coat pocket. Lance's voice trailed. "Whatever you've heard, it's probably just tired people venting. You know how it gets." Harrison placed a small tablet on the host's stand. The screen lit up instantly. He tapped play. The room went still. The video played without sound, just the footage. Lance in the hallway behind the kitchen, handing over the thick envelope to the distributor, receiving a crate in return. No scan, no invoice. Just a transaction built on silence. The angle shifted. A second clip. Lance stepping into frame as Elena handed a cup of water to a man outside the service door. Lance's hand came up. 2 fingers jabbed into her shoulder. She staggered. Caught herself, her face said everything. Lance's expression shifted. "That's not full context," he said too quickly. "You don't know what was going on before or after that. It's edited. You're showing one side." Harrison looked up for the first time. "I didn't come to argue," he said. "I came to show." The voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Lance opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. From the rear hallway, 2 men stepped forward. Plain clothes, one with a black earpiece, the other holding a sealed envelope. They didn't say a word. They didn't touch him. They didn't have to. Lance turned back toward Harrison. "You have no right," he said, his voice thinning. "You can't just walk in and—" Harrison reached into his other pocket, pulled out a document, laid it flat on the counter. A termination letter, signed by all 3 equity holders, notarized, effective immediately. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence said everything. Lance looked around. No one stepped forward. Not one voice came to his defense. A dishwasher paused mid-stack. A line cook leaned slightly closer to the heat lamp. Elena stood near the server station, her pen clenched in her fist, so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The 2 men escorted Lance through the back door. The hinges creaked once, then closed. Harrison looked around the floor. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. "Some of you knew who I was," he said. "Some of you didn't. That's fine. I wasn't here to be recognized." He turned to Elena. "But I saw what you saw. And more importantly, I believed it." He paused, not for effect, but for air. "This place was built on something better than fear. It's time we remembered that." No one applauded. No one needed to. He powered down the tablet, slipped it back into his pocket, turned to the hostess. who hadn't moved since he walked in. "Keep it in the office," he said quietly, "in case someone asks what changed." Then he walked toward the kitchen. No one stopped him, no one could. Because the man who had walked in last night as a shadow had returned today as a reckoning. The back prep room smelled like old onions and steam. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a yellow tint on stainless steel that had seen better years. Folding chairs were arranged in a loose circle, some still bearing stains from dinners long past. No one spoke. No one shifted. The staff sat with hands clasped, backs straight, as if they were waiting for a verdict they'd already rehearsed. Harrison Ford stood at the far end of the room, near the rusted shelf where spices hadn't been touched in months. He wasn't holding a speech, just a clipboard, and he wasn't looking at the walls or the floor. He looked at them, one by one. "You've been through more than you should in a place like this," he said. "I saw it, and I've seen enough to know this isn't your fault." The silence wavered, shoulders lowered. One cook exhaled, long and quiet. Harrison stepped forward and placed the clipboard on the prep table at the center of the group. The paper on top was clean, the print bold, a new title across the header: Operations Manager, Elena Mora. Elena didn't reach for it. She sat at the edge of her chair, hands tight in her lap, not blinking. Her apron still had a faint sauce stain down the side. Her name tag had been scrubbed until the crack in the corner looked polished. "This isn't a reward," Harrison said. "It's a beginning." She shook her head slowly. Her voice came out smaller than usual. "I don't think I'm the right person." "You're not," he said. "Not yet." Her eyes widened just slightly, "but you spoke up when no one else did. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't protest. You just handed someone the truth and hoped they wouldn't drop it. That takes more than courage. That takes trust." She looked at the clipboard like it might burn her fingers. "I didn't expect anything," she said. He nodded once. "That's exactly why it's yours." The room was still, the kind of stillness that came after a storm when people weren't sure whether to breathe yet. She reached forward. Her hand shook slightly as she picked up the pen. Her name came out in pieces, each letter pressed slower than the last. But she finished it. Her hand fell back to her lap. She didn't smile, not yet. But her shoulders shifted just enough to breathe. Behind her, one of the older kitchen hands cleared his throat. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Didn't think I'd live to see a day like this," he said. "Then let's make sure no one else waits as long," Harrison replied. He reached into his inside coat pocket and placed a sealed envelope next to the contract. "Inside is back pay for every undocumented wage adjustment," he said. "Tips that were never counted. Bonuses that should have been. Everyone will receive theirs by tomorrow." Another pause. This one heavier. A few of the staff glanced at each other, unsure whether to believe what they'd just heard. Harrison added a second envelope. "And this is a grant for mental health services. Quiet if you want. Confidential. 1 year. That includes your families." Elena's eyes welled, but the tears didn't fall. She turned slightly, brushing her cheek with the back of her wrist. Embarrassed, not broken, he stepped back, letting the quiet settle again. "This place wasn't built to be perfect," he said. "It was built to be better, and somewhere along the way we lost that. I'm not here to replace it, I'm here to repair it." He looked at the room one last time, not like a boss, not like a visitor, like someone returning to something that mattered. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the paper, the signatures, and the weight of change behind him. Not loud, not proud, just enough. 1 week later, the air inside Rustwood felt different. It wasn't louder, just lighter. Like something had been lifted from the floorboards. The laughter came slowly at first, cautious, unsure. But by Thursday, someone had cracked a joke near the dish station and no one flinched. The regulars returned, quietly at first, then with casual familiarity. A man who ordered the same meatloaf every Tuesday left a $10 tip and whispered to the busser, "Feels better in here." Technicians moved quietly through the restaurant, lifting ceiling tiles, adjusting mounts, rethreading wires. They replaced every old camera, one by one. The new models were smaller, more precise. But it wasn't the lens that caught anyone's attention. It was what sat just beneath each one, a small plaque, brushed metal, simple and silent. 4 words, engraved without flair. Monitored to protect, not to punish. No one talked about the plaques, but everyone saw them. They didn't glare like warnings, they rested like promises. Elena walked the floor with a clipboard in hand. Her steps were steady. Her smile was still small, but it no longer looked rehearsed. She adjusted schedules, spoke softly to the new hires, made notes in the margins. She still wiped menus that didn't need wiping, but now it looked like habit, not fear. Behind the kitchen pass, a teenage line cook leaned over to whisper something to the dishwasher. The boy laughed, not loud, but honest. It echoed across the grill just enough for someone to smile at table 8. The media had shown up 2 days after Lance was escorted out. A local paper ran the headline, "Community Steps In to Rebuild Rustwood." There was a photo posted online, the staff lined up near the entrance, smiles crooked but real. Elena stood near the center, arms crossed. A name tag with a new title clipped to her collar. Harrison Ford wasn't in the photo. He wasn't at the press briefing. He didn't take the calls from reporters. There was no quote, no credit. The man who walked in alone hadn't come for applause. He'd come to fix something that had broken in silence. The only trace he left behind was a piece of paper. It was taped to the wall just outside the kitchen, near the clock-in terminal. White paper, black block letters, nothing fancy, no name at the bottom, just a message. The value of a place is never found in who sits at the top. It is found in who has the courage not to stay silent when something is wrong. Someone asked who wrote it. No one answered. They didn't have to. Elena found it during closing shift. She stood in front of it for a long time, reading it twice, then once more slower. She peeled the tape carefully and folded the note with the kind of care usually reserved for things more fragile than paper. She slipped it into her wallet, behind her ID. Later that night, when the lights dimmed on their timer and the music faded into the soft hum of the vents, she stood in the doorway to the dining room, watching. Outside, the lot was empty. The Bronco was gone, but something else had stayed. Not a presence, not a voice, just the weight of someone who had chosen to act when it mattered most. And for the first time in a long time, silence didn't feel like fear. It felt like peace. The drawer stuck a little when Elena pulled it open. The wood had swollen from years of steam and weather, and most people had stopped using it altogether. But something made her try, maybe instinct, maybe timing. Inside, tucked between old receipts and a half-dead marker, was a small bundle wrapped in coarse burlap. No tag, no handwriting, just tied with a single strand of twine, neat and quiet. She closed the drawer softly and carried it to the back table, where the early shift staff were folding napkins in silence. She untied the knot and pulled back the fabric. Inside was a notebook, leather-bound, worn smooth around the edges. Dark brown, no logo, no decoration. The kind of notebook you didn't buy on impulse. The kind that stayed with someone for a long time. The first page was blank. The second page held a message, handwritten, centered. Keep your eyes open, trust the quiet ones, let no one steal the dignity of your work. There was no name. There didn't need to be. Elena stared at the words longer than she meant to. They didn't shout. They didn't beg to be understood. They simply sat there, waiting to be believed. A new hire, maybe 19, barely 2 weeks in, paused near the supply shelf and nodded at the notebook. "Is it true what they said?" he asked. "That the guy who came in last week used to own this place?" Elena didn't look up right away. She closed the notebook carefully and ran her hand once across the cover. Then she tucked it back into the burlap and tied the string again, the same way it had come. "He still does, technically," she said, "but he doesn't act like a boss. Not exactly." The kid tilted his head. "So who is he then?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Not sadness, just weight. "He's the one who didn't ask for a seat at the table," she said. "He just made sure it was still standing." The kid nodded, like he understood part of it. Maybe not all, but enough. Later that evening, when the last dish had been washed and the final register counted, Elena slipped the notebook into the office safe. She didn't lock it out of fear. She locked it the way you might cover a candle when the wind gets loud. Some things were too quiet to leave open. Outside, the wind picked up, pulling dry leaves across the parking lot. The sky had turned soft and orange, then gray, then almost nothing at all. No one had seen the Bronco leave. No one had watched Harrison Ford drive out of town. But by morning, the space he had filled, just briefly, was already folded back into routine. And still, everyone knew he'd been there. You could feel it in the way the dishwasher no longer flinched when someone spoke too sharply. In the way tips were counted now in the open, not behind closed doors. In the way silence had changed its shape, less like hiding, more like protection. Not a single name had been added to the wall, no new plaque hung over the door. No signature on the message outside the kitchen, but when the staff passed it, they read it anyway. And when they forgot, someone always read it again. No applause, just a notebook, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.